There are places in this country where maps give up, where the lines stop, and the land becomes something older than ownership. In one of those places, down a forgotten road that hasn't existed on paper since 1938, a family built a cabin from the bones of the trees they cut down and the silence they refused to break. When the last living member of that family was found, the ground beneath the cabin was soft with rot. Inside, there were no mirrors, no photographs, no clocks, only the smell of wood smoke, mildew, and something faintly metallic, the scent of blood too old to notice. The boy was discovered in the back room, sitting perfectly still beside a bed that hadn't been slept in for months. His eyes followed no one. His mouth hung open slightly, not in confusion, but as if speech were a thing he had never learned to believe in. His limbs were long, mismatched, his joints bent wrong, as though he'd been assembled from memory rather than birth. The investigators thought they had stumbled upon a crime scene, a murder, perhaps. But the truth was worse, much worse. The boy wasn't a victim of violence. He was its descendant. The living echo of generations that had folded into themselves until there was nowhere left for the blood to go but inward. When the coroner lifted him from the bed, his skin was cold, but not dead. He blinked, slowly, like something waking from a dream it didn't want to return to. No one knew his name. No one could find a birth record, a school record, not even a trace of a doctor's note. It was as if he had been born without permission. The sheriff called the state. The state called the hospital. The hospital called the Department of Health. Every call came back the same. No record, no file, no trace. Only one thing was certain. The boy had never known his parents. Not because they had abandoned him, but because they were never truly separate from him to begin with. They said the walls of the cabin were whispering that night, that the wind carried sounds like voices, trying to remember words they'd forgotten. The ground trembled as if something beneath it was shifting, resentful of being disturbed. And when the boy finally stood, unsteady and pale in the lantern light, one of the deputies saw his eyes reflected two faces, a man's and a woman's, overlapping perfectly, indistinguishable from one another. Which city are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Because what follows is not a story of cruelty. It's a record of inheritance. A lineage so tangled it began devouring itself, one birth at a time. The cabin sat in what had once been known as Dunlow Hollow, though the name had been erased from most county maps before the war. The land was cheap, too cheap, the kind that came with its own silence. Locals said the air there never warmed, that even in summer you could see your breath if you stood near the creek. Before it vanished from record, the hollow was home to 5 families. Only one stayed. Their name appeared in an 1874 census. A single entry written in trembling handwriting, then crossed out with a thick black line. No one ever replaced it. Old records, the kind written on brittle paper that turns to dust if you breathe too hard, mention the patriarch, Ephraim Dunlow. He arrived sometime after the Civil War with his wife and a wagon of furniture that wasn't theirs. He was quiet, but not kind. A man who believed the world was already ending and that salvation could only be found in blood. Pure blood. His blood. Over the decades, Ephraim's descendants stopped trading with outsiders. They stopped burying their dead in the town cemetery. They stopped appearing in church registers, marriage licenses, and census rolls. What they built instead was a kind of genetic monastery, a family dedicated not to faith, but to replication. By the turn of the century, Dunlow Hollow was a ghost geography. No roads led in, no mail came out. Hunters claimed to hear voices there. A man calling to himself from different parts of the forest. A woman singing a lullaby to no one. Those who went looking for the cabin never found it in the same place twice. It moved, they said, like it was alive, sliding between ridges and thickets to avoid being seen. When state surveyors came through in the 1930s, they noted the land as unsuitable for habitation. The soil was too thin, the trees stunted, the water iron heavy and black. They didn't notice the graves, shallow, unmarked. Some no larger than a cradle. The ground itself seemed to swallow the evidence, as if protecting what it contained. Then came the war. The men went away, the roads decayed, the hollow disappeared again, until 1947, when a county health inspector, following a complaint about something unnatural, drove as far as his truck could take him and walked the rest of the way. What he found was not ruin. It was preservation, a world trapped inside its own bloodline, repeating itself with diminishing returns. The boy, the one who would later be known only as Patient Ozo 37, was sitting by the stove, drawing circles in the ash with his fingers. The inspector wrote that the sound of his breathing filled the whole room. The boy looked up once, just once, and the inspector said he felt like he was being seen by something that had never learned what eyes were for. He turned and left without finishing his inspection. 3 days later, he came back with a deputy, a nurse, but a silence so deep it felt like respect. And that's when they realized the boy wasn't alone. In the corner of the single-room cabin was a wooden hatch, half covered by a rug that had been chewed through by mice. The nurse found it first. She lifted it slowly, expecting perhaps a root cellar or the remains of food stores. Instead, what rose from the opening was the smell of something that had never seen sunlight. Damp, sweet, and wrong. Underneath the floorboards lay a crawl space, barely high enough for a child to breathe in. Straw was scattered over the dirt, and in the middle of that straw was a girl. She didn't move when they called to her, didn't flinch when the light hit her face. Her eyes were open, but they were pale, almost white, like cataracts had been there since birth. When the nurse reached for her, the girl hissed softly, an animal sound without words. The boy above didn't react. He just kept tracing those circles in the ash, bigger now, overlapping, like he was trying to draw something he'd seen too many times to forget. The nurse carried the girl out into the open air. Her skin blistered instantly. She began to shake, not from fear, but from shock, as though her body didn't know what to do with daylight. The boy followed them to the doorway, but would go no farther. His hands were trembling. When the deputy tried to speak to him, the boy turned his face to the wall. He stayed that way until they left. The report from that day reads like a sermon delivered to no one. It lists 2 children, 1 male, 1 female, both malnourished, both exhibiting abnormal craniofacial features. It also mentions the parents, a man and a woman found lying together in the bed, both deceased, their faces nearly identical. The cause of death unknown, but the inspector wrote, almost in the margin, "It looks like they chose to stop." The children were taken to the county hospital. The boy didn't resist. He didn't cry. He simply turned his head toward the sound of the wind and waited, like he knew this part of the story had already been written for him. Doctors examined him, catalogued him, described him in ways that made him smaller, as if by naming his deformities, they could erase the horror of their origins. They noted the fused teeth, the webbed fingers, the asymmetry of the skull, but they didn't see the real damage. The way he looked at walls, as if listening to something, only he could hear. That night, when the nurse checked on him, he was awake, humming 3 notes, over and over. The same sound the girl had made under the floor. No one slept after that. The nurse quit the next morning. The inspector stopped signing his name on official reports, and the sheriff refused to go near Dunlow Hollow again. Because once you've looked into the eyes of a child who was never supposed to exist, you start to wonder what else is out there, still breathing in silence, waiting to be found. They moved the children to a state facility in southwestern Virginia, the kind built for people who didn't fit into any category. Not sick, not criminal, just unclassifiable. The building had once been a tuberculosis sanatorium, its halls long and echoing, with ceilings so high that sound never settled. The locals called it the Ridges, though no one remembered why. The boy was given a room of his own, a narrow bed, a metal basin, and a single window nailed shut from the outside. The girl was kept in the infirmary, under constant observation. She didn't move much anymore. Sometimes she whispered, but the words didn't belong to any known language. The doctors called it glossolalia, a trick of the mind under stress. But the nurses said it sounded more like remembering. The boy didn't speak at all. When they fed him, he ate with his hands, slowly, methodically, never spilling a single grain of rice. He wouldn't drink unless the cup was placed on the floor, and even then, only when no one was watching. He didn't respond to questions, names, or touch. But sometimes, when the night ward fell quiet, the orderlies heard 2 voices humming from different wings of the facility. The same 3 notes, separated by distance, in perfect unison. Doctors began to take an interest. One in particular, Dr. Harold Visher, arrived in the winter of 1949. He was a man obsessed with silence. His field notes described the boy not as a patient, but as a living artifact of genetic decay. He wanted to see what happened when language, memory, and lineage collapsed into one body. Visher brought photographs of faces, families, children, and houses. He wanted to see if the boy would recognize anything. But each image passed before those wide, colorless eyes without a flicker, until the doctor held up one photograph: the interior of the cabin, the stove, the bed, the corner where the boy had been found. The reaction was immediate and small. A twitch of the lip, a tightening of the jaw. Then the boy reached forward, slow and deliberate, and pressed his palm against the picture as if touching something that could still burn. When Visher tried to take it away, the boy let out a sound that didn't belong to any human throat. A low, mechanical groan, like a broken instrument learning how to breathe. Visher wrote that it was the first time he had felt afraid of a child, not for what the boy might do, but for what he represented. The complete absence of self, the erasure of origin, a body that had inherited only the memory of confinement. The girl died 3 months later. Pneumonia, they said. But her nurse insisted she'd stopped eating, stopped breathing, stopped existing long before her heart gave up. When they buried her, the boy didn't react. He didn't even look toward the window. But that night, the humming stopped. For the first time since they'd been found, the facility was silent, and in that silence, Dr. Visher wrote something in his private journal. A single sentence never included in the official report. The family line may be broken, but the sound remains. After the girl's death, something in the boy shifted, not outwardly, but in ways that unsettled those who worked the night ward. He began sleeping on the floor, directly beneath the nailed window. His face turned toward the boards, as though waiting for light that could never pass through. When the nurses tried to move him back to the bed, he resisted, not violently, but with a weight they described as unnatural, as if his small frame carried something older, heavier, than a human body should. Dr. Visher doubled his visits. He brought instruments, now a phonograph, a reel-to-reel recorder, and a microphone the size of a fist. He wanted to capture the boy's humming, the strange three-note sequence that no one could trace to any melody, hymn, or folk song. But when the microphone clicked on, the boy went completely still, his head tilted, eyes wide and pale. Then, from deep in his throat, came a whisper, the first word anyone had ever heard from him. It was not in English. It was not in any language the doctor recognized, but Visher swore it sounded like mother. From that moment, the boy began to mimic sounds around him, not words, but echoes, the flick of shoes on tile, the turning of keys, the faraway hum of the boiler. He became a chamber that remembered sound and played it back wrong. When orderlies passed his door, they would sometimes hear their own voices repeated, distorted, stretched thin, as though traveling through water. Within weeks, strange things began happening in the ward. Patients complained of hearing footsteps long after everyone had gone to bed. Nurses said they'd see shadows moving behind locked doors. And in the records room, the phonograph would sometimes start spinning on its own, playing back a recording Visher never remembered making. It was always the same sequence, 3 notes, then silence, then a child's breath too close to the microphone. Visher's superiors demanded he stop. They said he was contaminating evidence, feeding myth into medicine. But the doctor couldn't stop. The more he studied the boy, the more he saw patterns. Symmetry in the irregularities, repetition in the deformities. The skull, the fingers, even the webbing between his toes, all proportioned in precise ratios. As though, in their corruption, they had achieved some form of perfection nature never intended. On February 12, 1950, Visher entered the boy's room one last time. He left the phonograph running. Hours later, the nurse found the doctor sitting against the wall, his face blank, the boy gone. There were no signs of struggle, no broken locks, no footprints in the snow outside, just the window, open for the first time in years, the nails pried out cleanly from the inside, and the tape still spinning, 3 notes. Then the faint sound of breathing, moving away from the microphone. They searched the woods behind the ridges for 3 days. Snow had fallen overnight, a heavy, wet silence that buried every trace of direction. The sheriff's men swept through the hollows with lanterns, calling his name, though none of them knew what name to call. By the 4th day, they stopped looking. The state wrote the boy off as escaped or deceased, though the official report never made it past the first draft. Dr. Visher was suspended. He stopped speaking at conferences, stopped answering his mail. His colleagues said he went grey in a month. He resigned that spring and retreated to an abandoned farmhouse on the edge of Wise County, carrying only boxes of tapes, notes, and photographs no one would ever see again. But then, in the autumn of that same year, the first letters began arriving. They came from small towns scattered across the Appalachians, Harlan, Grundy, Pikerville, each written by someone who swore they'd seen a figure wandering the back roads at dusk. Barefoot, silent, dressed in rags. Some called him a boy. Others said he looked wrong, like his face hadn't finished deciding what it wanted to be. They said he never begged, never spoke, just watched. And always, there was that sound. 3 notes, low and drawn out, like a lullaby without words. A woman in Hazard claimed he appeared outside her window one night while her newborn cried. She said the crying stopped. Not faded, not quieted, but stopped, like someone had turned off a switch. When she looked again, he was gone, and her baby was staring at the ceiling with glassy, unblinking eyes. In every letter, the pattern was the same sound: silence, disappearance. Visher began mapping the reports, tracing lines between towns. He noticed they formed a slow, deliberate path, always moving southward, through abandoned mining camps, ghost towns, and collapsed hollows long erased from county maps. He called the sheriff of Wise County, the only man who'd once stood inside that cabin in Dunlow Hollow. He asked him one question. What if he's not wandering? What if he's going home? That winter, locals began hearing something carried on the wind between the mountains. At first it sounded like an old church bell, a faint metallic hum that rose at dusk and faded by dawn. But if you listened too closely, you could tell it wasn't a bell at all. It was breath, measured, rhythmic, familiar. When the thaw came, a hiker found something at the edge of an old property near Dunlow, a cabin, half collapsed, with a single footprint in the mud beside the door. Small, bare. Inside, on the stove, was a melted tape recorder. The tape had fused to the reel, but one sound had survived: 3 notes. Then silence. Then the faint sound of 2 voices, humming together. The state never reopened the case. Too much time had passed, too many hands had changed. The boy became a myth, whispered by Coleman and mountain wives. The hollow child, the ash mouth, the son of silence. Each story a little different, but all ending the same way, with sound fading where breath should be. By 1961, Dr. Harold Visher was living alone in that crumbling farmhouse, his mind unraveling by the same slow rhythm that had once fascinated him. He wrote long letters no one read, pages filled with looping script, diagrams of the human skull overlaid with strange notations that looked more like music than anatomy. His neighbors said he'd sit on the porch through the night, a phonograph beside him, replaying a single recording over and over. The same warp tape from that final day at the Ridges, the one with the boys humming. One night, a traveling preacher stopped by, seeking shelter from a storm. He found Visher still there, seated in his chair, his face lit by lightning flashes. The preacher later told the county coroner that the old man didn't seem dead, only paused, mid-thought, his eyes locked on the recorder, still spinning beside him. The coroner's report listed the cause as heart failure. But beneath his notes, the sheriff who handled the body scribbled something strange. Ears ruptured. No signs of trauma. When the preacher tried to play the tape that had been left spinning, it jammed at first, then began to unspool, whispering through the player in jagged, broken tones. At first, just static, then the 3 notes. Then a voice, faint, layered, not the boy's, but the doctor's own, whispering, "He's not gone. He's listening." The tape snapped there. But the sheriff who boxed Visher's belongings swore he heard something afterward. Not on the tape, not in the room, but behind him. A sound like slow breathing, too close, too steady to be wind. He turned, but the window was open, and the snow outside lay untouched. They burned the farmhouse 3 days later, by order of the county. But even as the roof caved and the walls turned to ash, the fire chief said he could still hear something under the crackle, low, metallic, almost mechanical. 3 notes, then silence. In the years that followed, hikers and surveyors passing through the abandoned hollows of Virginia and Kentucky claimed to hear the same thing. A hum that traveled with the fog, rising from beneath the ground. Some said it came from the empty wells. Others swore it came from inside the trees, hollowed out from within. And sometimes, when the mist was low, they saw shapes moving, small, pale figures, watching but never approaching, always barefoot, always humming. When asked what they looked like, most refused to say. But one old man, half drunk and shaking, finally whispered, "They all looked like him. Every one of them. Same face. Same eyes. Like the mountain remembered how to make him again." By the time the 70s came, the story of the boy, the one they found in Dunlow Hollow, had passed fully into folklore. Coal camps told it around fires. Schoolchildren dared each other to whisper his name into the woods at dusk. But the deeper truth, the part that couldn't be spoken, stayed sealed in a few forgotten boxes in the state archives. Inside one of those boxes, discovered decades later by a graduate researcher from Richmond, were the remnants of Dr. Visher's private work, brittle tapes, glass slides, and a bound notebook wrapped in oilcloth. The handwriting inside began orderly, clinical, but grew frantic, looping into spirals that filled whole pages. He wrote of patterns, of echoes, of a lineage that refused extinction. He claimed the boy's DNA, taken during his confinement, contained something he couldn't explain: recursive mutations, doubling back upon themselves, repeating the same code as if trying to rebuild a single, perfect form. One phrase appeared again and again in his notes: "The body remembers the original." In the final entry, written days before his death, Visher recorded one last phenomenon. He described hearing the boys humming from somewhere below his floorboards. Faint, mechanical, like a phonograph running without power. He wrote that the sound was accompanied by the smell of wet soil and smoke, and that his reflection in the mirror did not match the movement of his face. He ended with 4 words: "He has found voice." The tapes recovered beside the journal were mostly ruined by mold and heat, but one, labeled Dunlow 1950 Reversed, was still intact. When archivists played it, the sound that emerged was slow and warped, like breathing stretched across a long tunnel. And beneath that, buried deep within the static, was a voice. Not the boys, not the doctors, but something in between. A layered sound, young and old at once, whispering, "We are all still here." The tape was sealed again. The archivist who handled it left her position 2 months later, citing insomnia and auditory hallucinations. Her replacement filed the materials under "Own verified case, Dunlow incident." And the box disappeared from the index shortly after. But the hum returned, first in radio interference near the Appalachian ridges, then in underground miners' recordings, and later in digital spectrograms uploaded to obscure online forums. Always the same pattern, always the same 3 notes, and those who listened too long swore that beneath it, almost imperceptible, was breathing. Measured, familiar, close. In 1983, a field surveyor in Mingo County stumbled across a ruin, a collapsed cabin buried in ivy. In the fireplace, he found something fused into the brick, the shape of a child's hand, perfectly preserved, pressed deep into the stone, as though made molten by heat. When he touched it, he said the wall was still warm. And somewhere beyond the trees, something hummed back. By the late 1990s, the story had become little more than a superstition, something told by the old to keep the young from wandering too deep into the woods. But every few years, something small would stir the ashes: a recording, a disappearance, a sound that no one could explain. The last account came from a man named Eli Warren, a sound technician hired by the state to document ambient noise in the abandoned mining tunnels beneath Wise County, the same region where Dr. Visher once lived and where Dunlow Hollow had long ago been erased from maps. Eli wasn't a believer. He thought folklore was just rural poetry, fear shaped into story. But during the third night of recording, his instruments picked up something impossible. It began as feedback, low, distant, rhythmic. Then it stabilized, 3 distinct tones, perfectly spaced. He recognized them immediately from an old case file he'd read years ago. The Ridges, 1949. He followed the sound deeper into the shaft, where air turned heavy and damp. The light from his headlamp bending oddly in the mist. The deeper he went, the clearer it became. No longer mechanical, but human, humming. When he reached the end of the tunnel, the hum stopped. There was only dripping water and the smell of rot. He raised his recorder, speaking softly into the mic. "If someone's here, say something." Silence. Then, a child's breath, right beside the microphone. Eli dropped the recorder. The playback later revealed only 7 seconds of clear sound, 3 notes. Then another, deeper, layered over the first, older somehow. Then a voice, faint but unmistakably human, whispering, "You remembered us." The recording ended there. Eli was never found. Only his equipment, still running, its red light blinking in the dark, was recovered. After that, the tunnels were sealed. The state declared them unsafe due to geological instability. But the locals still talk about the hum that travels through the hills after sunset. Some say it's the wind caught between hollows. Others say it's the soil itself remembering the sound of what it once buried. And those who've heard it, truly heard it, describe the same thing. It begins soft, almost tender, as though calling something home. Then the tone deepens, the air thickens, and every bird, every insect, every living thing falls silent. 3 notes, then breath, then a second voice joining from far away, higher, smaller, but perfectly in tune. They say if you hear it long enough, it starts to shape itself into words. Words you somehow already know. Because the story was never about a boy who escaped. It was about a sound that learned how to survive. A lineage reborn not in flesh, but in frequency. And somewhere, beneath the black soil of Dunlow Hollow, the mountain exhales and hums back. END.